We now present the 5th programme in the series Heydays in Owlstocks on the life and times of Lord Lucan.
This programme was made with the support of Sound and Vision Broadcasting Funding Scheme, a BCI initiative.
The Lucan connection would be here much longer than a lot of the natives. I can go back about 5 or 6 generations in my family. Most families can go back 5 or 6 generations. Perhaps some of them might be able to go back 7 or 8 generations, but that's all. But the Lucan Binghams can go back to the 1550s. They came in to reap the benefits. They were the power of the day. And their connections is with Castlebar ever since. And of course, the Lady Diana connection, the second Earl of Spencer married Lord Lucan's daughter. They had the reception in the Lawn House, which was English Manor, really. The ballroom is still there. There was a dispensation from the Church of Ireland for them to even hold the ceremony up in the Lawn House. So the second Earl of Spencer married Lady Diana. So Lady Diana is connected. There was also a famous judge, Judge Spencer, who presided over the Mantrosna murders in Galway. And the missing Lord Lucan was in Castlebar in the 50s. He came here with his mother when he was a young fella. They stayed in Daly's Hotel, the Imperial. And one lady who's now in her early 60s was a young lady in secondary school, and they were brought out by the nuns to sing some songs or whatever for Lady Lucan and the missing Lord Lucan when he was a young fellow.
He is the 7th Earl of Lucan, who has left more questions than answers for the people of Castlebar to ponder on. A gambler who got his kicks from taking risks. A socialiser in keeping with his family's status. Always at ease, living the high life and the razzmatazz that went with his title. And also living a life of intrigue and drama, played out in scenes and acts similar to a heart-stopping thriller. So much so that to this day, nobody knows for sure if he's alive or dead. Missing for close on 30 years, this is the story of the Binghams and its most famous family member, Richard John, the 7th Earl of Lucan.
The first Bingham, really, to make any attempt at Castlebar or to arrive in about Castlebar was Richard Bingham. I mean, infamous in the sense that he was one of Elizabeth's great agents in Ireland at the end of the 1590s. The point about him was that everybody else had gone out and found countries everywhere and land everywhere, including bits and pieces of America, and he kind of ended up at the tail end of everything. And he ended up coming into Connacht, and he cut a swathe through Connacht and wiped out the Burkes. I mean, he really was. Even by the standard of the time, he was a particularly unpleasant character, Richard Bingham. And as is typical, I suppose, he's a bit Irish more than English, he decided, to hell with it, I'll give the brother a bit of look in this. So he got his brother John, and he sold him the Burke lands around Castlebar. And John Bingham ended up owning the whole of Mayo, essentially. And Richard went off and became Lord Sligo, and John was given the whole of Mayo to create his own little dynasty. Only problem with creating a dynasty is you need children, and he wasn't producing any children, so all sorts of funny things began to happen. They managed, throughout their whole history, to give the impression they were on everybody's side. The result being that by about 1700, they were safely ensconced in Castlebar. They had got a couple of half-baked titles like the Baronet of Nova Scotia. They were rising through the ranks, and I suppose life seemed pretty good for them, as it would have for all peoples at that stage. The Browns at that point, which they need to come into the story, would be starting to flex their wings slightly as well. So Mayo ended up with two really, really powerful families, the Browns and the Binghams. And what marked the Browns and the Binghams for the rest of the time would be, you could nearly put them into two categories. The Binghams only saw Ireland as a source of revenue. It really was it was a starting point for political power. But Melton Mowbray was their home. Shropshire was where they existed. And I mean, for them, that was the real centre of power. And they set their sights on really being politicians and soldiers. That would have been their two big claims to fame. On the other hand, the Browns, for some odd reason, decided that there was money to be made here, and they were more concerned with the making of money than the making of power, if you wish. So the Browns tended to stay here. They married they married pretty well, but they married into merchant families. They sort of owned the estates in the West Indies, all of that sort of carry on. And they became quite powerful. And their politics would have been local politics, and they were nearly always the magistrates. Now, by default, the Binghams, in their place, they were magistrates as well, but they were never here, so they never exercised their right. They ended up being related to everybody, most notably the Spencers, who you have to remember, we only know the Spencers through Lady Diana and the Spencer Street connection, if you wish. But there was a time when the Althorpes, who were the Lord Spencers, were the second in command to the royal family. They were the family. So for the Lucans to marry into that family meant that they were now touching, if you wish, royalty. The ones in the 20s and 30s, I think, and maybe up into the 40s, they saw the empire shrinking, and I think they realised the writing seriously was on the wall. But I think their sons, the 7th Earl particularly, were caught in an absolute time war.
During the famine, Lucan's agents, they evicted people left, right and centre here. Now, whether it came directly from Lucan or not is a question I would like to study. The thing about it at the time is the agents were the people who enforced the landlord's wish. He could be dining and wining in England or with his mistresses on the continent. But you had the local bully and thug who with his gangs could throw people out. And of course he probably would get a cut of the money and send the rest to Lucan. Lucan wouldn't be particularly bothered what was happening. But the famine struck hard here, very hard. And then in the middle of the famine, they threw out people on the road. So it's absolutely horrific when you read the account. Mention the Lucan name. When I was a child, people nearly spit on the road.
The 3rd Earl is the most famous one, of course. To put it quite bluntly, he was a scoundrel. He was, I'd say, a troubled man. He reaped his revenge on the misfortunates in Castlebar. He was in the famous charge of the Light Brigade, and he was nicknamed, they say that the nickname was based on the present missing Lucan, Lucky Lucan, but it was really him. When he came back to Castlebar and went up through Rock Square and up to his mansion, the people were waving out and waving flags at the return of the great hero, but they were laughing as well, and they were shouting, "Lucky Lucan, you're lucky to have your arse in your pants." And that's where I think that Lucky Lucan expression came from. The 4th Earl of Lucan was a young officer in the charge of the Light Brigades. He was a young officer, and he was the one that handed over all the property to Castlebar. Well, really, he was given back what his ancestors took in the first place. It seems that the De Burkes in Galway defeated him, and he reaped revenge on the De Burkes in Duneil outside Ballinrobe. And a little boy of 7 and a little boy of 10 were actually hung. And then they made their ways into Castlebar, and there was the Burkes of Castlebar were the last to stand against him, really. They stood against him, but he defeated them, and he massacred every one of them. He hung them. He didn't shoot them or put them to the sword. He actually hung them to defeat them. So there was a savagery there, power, money and power and titles. He lived in the castle then for a good number of years. One man who travelled through the area in the 1730s or the 1750s wrote an article, and he described the conditions of the castle. It was falling into ruin at that stage, and poor furniture, and Bingham was living in poor conditions. Then they built a beautiful house. Now people refer to it as the Lawn House, but the real title for it is Aglish Manor. That would be the 9th century name of Castlebar. So it was Aglish Manor, lovely I think it was late Georgian, beautiful. It's still standing there. And there's a lovely ballroom. Now they added pieces to it in the Victorian period, the kitchen and that. And then when the convent, the nuns took over, they added a whole wing to it in the 1930s. And it married into the old building, so it looks very similar. The lawn itself was Lucan's private domain, Bingham's or Lucan's private domain. The bacon factory was Lucan's farmyard. That was set up and built in the 1830s, 1840s. Because if you look at the 1839 map, it's there. The 1809 map, it's not there. They were very self-sufficient. It seems to produce tweed, milk, cheese, beef. Mrs. Lucan set up a tweed industry or a light lace industry. In fact, there was a beautiful stand in front of the fireplace in the old convent that depicted a scene of washing or tucking the linen or the flax for the linen industry. Of course, they set up the linen industry as well in Linen Hall. They used the knowledge of people who came in from Northern Ireland in the 1750s from the Battle of the Diamond, and they brought in their talents. About 5,000 refugees came into Mayo back then, and the Fitzgeralds first, and then the Lucans used and exploited their talents and set up the industry. That went very well from about 1750 to about 1860.
The Lucans. Richard John Bingham, usually known as John, the future 7th Earl of Lucan, was born on the 18th of December 1934. He went to Eton, where he discovered the great passion of his life, gambling. In 1953, he joined the Coldstream Guards, where he spent much of his off-duty time playing poker or visiting casinos. After leaving the army, he joined a merchant bank, but by now gambling was his first priority. One night, after a substantial win at Chemin de Fer, he decided to quit his job and become a professional gambler. His gambling nickname was Lucky. In March 1963, he was introduced to Veronica Duncan, whose sister was the wife of Bill Shand Kidd. They were married the following November. 2 months later, John Bingham's father died, and the couple became the 7th Earl and Countess of Lucan. On the 24th of October 1964, their first child, Lady Frances, was born. By then, they were living at the Lower Belgrave Street house. In September 1967, their son George was born, followed by another daughter, Camilla, in June 1970. Lady Lucan's main concerns during that period were caring for the children and supervising the house and staff, and she had little time or opportunity to develop independent interests of her own. She suffered from postnatal depression after the birth of her children, and in 1968 Lord Lucan encouraged her to have treatment, and she agreed if it could be based at home. He took an interest in her condition and studied books on psychiatry. Lady Lucan believes that she was prescribed drugs which were inappropriate for her condition, and states that subsequently doctors have expressed amazement at the poor treatment she received. By now, however, the relationship was breaking down. Lady Lucan became increasingly concerned about her husband's continued heavy losses at the gaming tables. She felt that he was dangerously addicted to gambling and should have treatment for it. He had also refused to put money aside for the children's education. Lady Lucan instructed solicitors, which caused a deterioration in the relationship, and after a turbulent Christmas 1972, they separated. From then on, Lucan was determined to gain custody of his children. In March 1973, he obtained a court order and took the 2 younger children while they were out with their nanny, then collected Frances from school. For the next 3 months, Lady Lucan was cared for by hired nurses, and during this time voluntarily went into a psychiatric clinic for a week. Lucan had been hoping that the medical reports would now show that Lady Lucan was not fit to have custody of the children. Although the medical reports were a dominant feature of the custody battle, Lady Lucan states that she does not believe that her husband ever genuinely thought that she was mentally ill, only that it was a ploy in the attempt to gain custody. She did not have any prior history of mental illness, and her problem appeared to have been related to the postnatal depression inappropriately treated. Lord Lucan paid the medical bills and discussed Lady Lucan's condition with the doctor without her knowledge. She feels strongly that he must have made statements that would have coloured the doctor's opinion of her medical condition and the required treatment. Lord Lucan would also telephone Lady Lucan and provoke her into verbalising her negative feelings about him, which he then recorded, and later produced in evidence against her. It is usual for peers of the realm to win custody of their children, and Lord Lucan must have felt confident that he would do so. But in June, to his surprise and mortification, the court ordered that the children be returned to their mother. On the face of it, Lucan's motivation in the custody battle would appear to have been an obsession with the welfare of his children, yet there were curious inconsistencies in his behaviour. By now, with a family to support, a nanny to pay, houses to maintain, and legal bills from the custody case, Lucan was deeply in debt. He was also continuing to lose at the tables. He kept a constant watch on the house, and still entertained hopes that he could go back to court and regain custody. He also would try to arrange for Lady Lucan to be bought off with a sum of money, but this came to nothing. He hired private detectives to watch the house, and when he went there to collect the children for his access visits, made secret tape recordings. When he could no longer afford to pay private detectives, he did the snooping himself.
He had this sense of personal honour that we find difficult to understand nowadays. The closest you would get in the 20th century to it would be the Japanese harikiri thing of committing suicide rather than surrendering. This is, again, it's personal. I'm looking back at the family and I'm looking back at what they would have passed on, the world he would have lived in, what he would have been told about it. You know, you are a Luke, you are a Bingham, and we are, if you wish, the chosen race. And, you know, we do not shame ourselves or our family. And this is the whole thing about, they managed in a particularly tight little circle of people in London, they managed to keep that out of, and come on, 74, 75, the tabloids are out there even then, and they're looking for salacious material, and what more salacious can you get than a lord and his wife who are not getting on very well? I mean, this is pure tabloids journalism, and it's ready for them. So, I mean, I think he would not have brought shame on his family. And when I'm talking about his family, I'm talking about himself.
The good life came to an end when his marriage failed, and he was in debt. He was bankrupt, but he was surrounded with very wealthy people as well. And it seems that the last straw was that he was going to lose his children, and he didn't want that. He seemed to have a connection with them, or he wanted to have a connection with them, and he waited, it seems, according to story and legend and some of a fact in Scotland Yard and books that I've read, that he waited in the dark, removed the light, and he felt that he had actually killed his wife, disposed of her, but it seems it was the housekeeper who was off the same statue, and he killed that young woman.
At 9:45 on the night of the 7th of November 1974, a distressed and blood-stained woman burst into the bar of the Plumber's Arms in Lower Belgrave Street, crying out, "Help me! Help me! Help me! I've just escaped from being murdered. He's in the house. He's murdered the nanny." She was the Countess of Lucan, who had fled from her home at number 46, leaving behind her 3 children. She was obviously the victim of a serious assault, and the police and an ambulance were called to the scene. The police officers who arrived to investigate found a substantial house with a ground floor, a basement and 4 upper floors. Forcing open the front door, they searched the premises and found the children in their bedrooms unharmed. The door to the basement was open. There was no light in the hall, so they fetched a flashlight. They descended the stairs to the breakfast room and found the walls splashed with blood. A pool of blood on the floor with some male footprints in it, and near the door connecting the breakfast room to the kitchen, a blood-stained sack. The top of the sack was folded over but not fastened. Inside was the corpse of Sandra Rivet, the children's nanny. She had been battered to death with a blunt instrument. In the hallway was a length of lead piping covered in surgical tape. very bent, out of shape, and heavily blood-stained. The back door was unlocked. When Lady Lucan was able to make a statement to the police, she named her husband as her attacker and the murderer of Sandra Rivet. Of Lord Lucan there was no sign. Shortly after 10 p.m, Mrs. Madeline Floorman, a friend of the Lucans, who lived a short distance away, was dozing in front of the TV after a tiring day when she was awoken by someone pressing the doorbell insistently. Assuming it was a local youth who had done this kind of thing before, she ignored it and went back to sleep. Sometime later the phone rang. She was sure that the caller was Lord Lucan, but he sounded distressed and became incoherent. She put the phone down and went back to sleep. Later, some spots of what appeared to be blood were found on her doorstep. At approximately 10:30 that evening, Lord Lucan telephoned his mother, who lived in St. John's Wood, telling her there had been a catastrophe at the house and he wanted her to collect the children. She went straight there, found the place occupied by police and informed them that the Lucans were separated. The children were wards of court and that Lord Lucan currently resided at a nearby flat. She then took the children to her home. The police searched Lord Lucan's flat. He was not there, but they found his car keys, passport, chequebook, driving licence, wallet and glasses. His blue Mercedes car was parked outside. The battery was flat. It had been suffering from battery trouble for some time. Lord Lucan was driving another car that night, a Ford Corsair he had borrowed from a friend some 2 or 3 weeks previously. He had in fact insisted that he wanted the car for that particular evening. It was about 11:30 p.m. when he arrived at Uckfield, Sussex, at the home of his friends Ian and Susan Maxwell Scott. The house was 42 miles from Lower Belgrave Street, a journey of about an hour at average speed, though he was a fast driver and might have taken less time. Ian Maxwell Scott was away, but his wife admitted Lord Lucan and was surprised to see him in dishevelled daytime clothing. His flannels looked as though they had been stained and something sponged off. This was Lord Lucan's story, as told to Susan Maxwell Scott. He had been walking past the Lower Belgrave Street house and had peeped in through the basement window. He had seen someone struggling with his wife, Lady Lucan, in the basement kitchen. He let himself in through the front door and ran down the stairs. He slipped and fell in a pool of blood, and the man had run off. Calmed Lady Lucan down and taken her upstairs to try and clean her up. But while he was in the bathroom, she had run out of the house shouting murder. He panicked, realising things looked very bad for him, and decided to get out. Between that time and arriving at the Maxwell Scotts, he said he had made 3 phone calls. One to Mrs. Floorman, one to his mother, and he had also tried to telephone Bill Shand Kidd, who was married to Lady Lucan's sister, but there was no reply. Mrs. Maxwell Scott said that he did not tell her where he made these calls from, but she got the impression that they had been made after he left the house. At 12:15 he rang his mother from the Maxwell Scott's house to check that she had the children, and rang Bill Shand Kidd again, but there was no reply. Lord Lucan then wrote 2 letters, both addressed to Bill Shand Kidd at his home in Bayswater. They were posted the following day. The envelopes were found to have smears of blood on them. Mrs. Maxwell Scott tried to persuade him to remain so they could go to the local police the next morning, but he said he had to get back. He drove away. There has been no validated sighting of him since. 3 days after the murder, the Ford Corsair was found abandoned at Newhaven. Bloodstains were found inside of both Type A and Type B. Also, a piece of bandaged lead piping, unstained, but very similar to the one found in the murder house.
The subsequent inquest into the murder of Sandra Rivet proved complicated and intricate, with numerous testimonies and allegations, but the evidence of Lady Lucan herself proved critical.
Lady Lucan had said after being attacked that she had been struck with something that felt as though it had been bandaged. The weapon, left near the door leading to the basement, was a length of lead piping wrapped with tape. A light bulb had been found on a chair by the stairway in the basement. it had been taken from the light at the bottom of the stairs, the only one which could have been turned off by the switch at the top of the stairs. The other basement lights were undisturbed. A casualty officer testified to Lady Lucan's injuries: 7 large lacerations on her scalp, bruising to her eye, and injuries to the palate and on the back of her throat, all completely in keeping with her description of the attack. The second letter to Bill Shan Kidd was read out, and this mentioned an upcoming sale at Christie's which would satisfy bank overdrafts. It was signed Lucky, his gambling name. It was found that his total overdrafts exceeded £14,000, although his total debts were far greater. Lucan's mother was insistent that he had called her much earlier than the 10:45 previously suggested, more like 10:30. She also denied the suggestion that Lucan had said he was driving past the house. This was important, as it was possible to see into the basement if on foot, but not from a car. The pathologist Professor Keith Simpson testified that the injuries to the 2 women were similar in nature. Susan Maxwell Scott testified about her visit from Lord Lucan on the 7th of November. She stated that Lucan had told her he had interrupted a fight between his wife and a man in the basement, and slipped in some blood. Lady Lucan had been hysterical and had told him that the nanny was dead, and accused Lucan of hiring someone to kill her. He said that Lady Lucan had indicated the sack to him, and he had seen the blood but had not examined anything too closely. A third letter from Lucan was then read out. This had been sent to the friend who had lent him the Corsair, and referred to a traumatic night of unbelievable coincidences, and asked that his children should know that all he cared about was them. Supporters of Lord Lucan have suggested that the coincidence was his passing the house at the identical moment Lady Lucan was being attacked, although the unexpected presence of Sandra Rivet is coincidence enough for the murderer. The evidence on bloodstaining needs careful examination. Sandra's blood was Group B, and Lady Lucan is Group A. The area around the top of the hall stairs leading to the basement was an obvious site of attack. A pattern of radiating blood splashes showed that a victim had been battered. The bloodstains were Group A, and sticking to some of them were hairs of a type similar to Lady Lucan's. One stain appeared to be Group AB, but that could have been the result of an A and B types mixing. There was also a great many greyish-blue textile fibres. Some were on a blood-stained towel, some were stuck to the blood-stained lead pipe, still more, together with some of Lady Lucan's hair and blood, were in the Ford Corsair. This was extensively stained with both A and B type blood, with some areas of mixed types. A writing pad in the car had had a piece torn roughly out. This matched the piece used to write the note to the car's owner. At the bottom of the stairs, in the breakfast room, was another attack site with numerous blood splashes. There was a large area of blood staining near the piano, and some blood-stained footprints of a man's shoes. These stains were all Group B. One small spot of blood on the floor was Group A, and the sack was heavily stained with Group B blood, but with some indications of Group A. Lady Lucan's clothes were heavily stained with her own blood, but there was a small amount of Group B staining on her dress, some Group B spots on her shoes with staining on the soles and arches. There was some question as to whether this staining meant that Lady Lucan had been in the basement after the murder, although it was thought that the staining could also have happened through contact with the stained clothing of her attacker. The expert said that the attacker would have been spattered with blood, although that might not have been obvious, and when the body was put in the sack, his clothes could have become saturated. The smears of blood on the letter to Bill Shan Kidd gave an A-B reaction. There was also blood-stained leaves in the garden, and these were type B. The piece of lead piping was grossly distorted and was stained with both type A and type B blood. The inquest jury was out for only 31 minutes, and their verdict was murder by Lord Lucan. It was the last time that an inquest jury exercised its right to name a murderer. As a direct result of this case, the right was abolished by the Criminal Law Act of 1977.
In Castlebar, the Lucan estate remains the ground rent landlord for more than 70 homes and businesses. But in the town, the feeling is that the agents who are now seeking outstanding rents and offering terms to tenants should, like their patron, also vanish. For more than 20 years, Castlebar residents have refused to pay their ground rent, primarily on the premise that they shouldn't pay a penny to a man who is so famously missing.
When Lord Lucan disappeared in November 1974 after the brutal murder of his children's nanny, Sandra Rivet, the spotlight on the ground rents actually came on Castlebar in a major way because he was missing and people couldn't pay ground rents. Now, it was claimed at the time that something in the region of £30,000 a year was accruing to his estate from the landowners in Castlebar. It became headline material every November as the anniversaries rolled on as to where was Lucan and what happened to him, how would we do away with this ground rent. Now, in that time, I know with ministers in Kilkenny and Pádraig Flynn who made several representations to the British authorities to do away with the ground rent, without success, I say. And I know they met the British ambassador at the highest level, and they went to the British government to try and resolve this, but it didn't succeed. Now, it's still ongoing understanding that people that do owe ground rent, if they want to sell their land and to get freehold, that they have to pay up the rent and buy it out. And I think that is still happening today.
In fact, the office in which I'm sitting here was a house that was originally ground rented to the Lucan estate. Under the law of the land here, a facility was brought in many years ago that you could actually buy out ground rents. And the ground rent that was originally payable to the Lucan estate and payable to his agent in Castlebar was bought out by me for this building. It was a very small amount, but that gave me an interest in what used to happen when the Lucan estate comprised of about 60,000 acres and several thousand tenants from whom ground rent was actually collected. As you're aware, the problem with the ground rent was that you could actually build on the ground, a commercial premises or whatever, but still not own the ground upon which the building was constructed, which was of serious consideration to both families and commercial businesses in this town. I met with one of his relations in respect of the declaration of Lord Lucan being formally deceased, formally dead. And the late Dick Marren used to say that the ground rent would be paid whenever Lord Lucan came to collect it. And as you know, Scotland Yard and Interpol and many of the international police forces have been on the trail of Lord Lucan for many years. Some say that he was still alive. Some say that he has been seen in South America or South Africa, despite the fact that a boat was found in the channel and evidence of garments on the seashore after his disappearance originally. So it's a question as to whether or not he has been spirited away by his contacts or connections many years ago. In any event, legally speaking, the agents of Lord Lucan here in the town are probably still open to receiving ground rents, and even though the payments are quite small, I'm sure it would amount to a considerable sum of money if collected over the years. Well, I think the matter should be ended. I don't believe that Lord Lucan is alive. Lucky Lucan himself was never here, and obviously there was a very, very strong connection with the Lucan family and Castlebar over the years. And I suppose when times got rough, the Mall, as it's now currently called, was the original cricket ground of the Lucan family, and that was given to the people of Castlebar. So the Lucans did well out of the tenants in this town, and I think it's time to end this. I actually made a recommendation a number of years ago that whatever monies are held in a state should be put into some community venture in the town here, or given to some charitable cause that would be worthy of receiving of whatever is in that account. And there should be a situation brought about that an amnesty declared, for want of a better word, where you could resolve this matter and let those whom ground rents still apply to have it sorted out in their favour.
In all honesty, if they wanted to have good public relations and good communication skills, yes, get the money together and build something for Castlebar or give it to some charity, but build something that would perhaps correct some of the wrong that was done in the past by their ancestors, and actually build houses for the poor, or build an extra wing onto the hospital, or build a unit for the elderly. In other words, if there is money there, the rumours has it that there's thousands of money, thousands of pounds or thousands of euros now in some account somewhere. If it was possible, don't take the money.
As the mystery about Lord Lucan continues, modern technology has become involved in trying to establish whether he's dead or alive. A website, whereislucan.com, is offering a substantial reward for any information leading to evidence of his death or existence. The website has been set up by an Englishman with a keen interest in the Lucan dynasty. Ian tells us that the responses to his website have been varied.
We've had several interesting sort of situations that have arisen as a result of putting that website up. Initially, we were offering, through the media, basically, a very large sum of money because, like many people, we'd like to sort of see a conclusion brought to this case. And as our investigations have proceeded over the past several years, we've reduced that amount now down to 100,000 Great British pounds. And basically what we're looking for is details of the person who spent their life with Lord Lucan when he went on the run after the murder of Sandra Ribbett. There's no getting away from the fact that after the murder, Richard John Bingham, otherwise known as the 7th Earl of Lucan, actually did go on the run. In an interview less than 12 months after the murder and the attempted murder of Lady Veronica Lucan, Lady Lucan herself gave an interview to the press in which she was of the clear opinion that her husband had managed to evade capture and would have set up a new life in another country. And asked whether if she would ever like to meet him again, her response was that she would very much like to, although she thought it highly unlikely. What then transpired was that shortly after she gave this interview, she was put on medication, and in her own words, she was basically abused by these drugs. And from that point in time, she always had altered her opinion, and her line has always been, as I say, since that point in time, that she basically believed that her husband had died on or about the 7th of November 1974. So there was this great change of attitude which came over from Lady Lucan. Now, the most up-to-date information that I have is that earlier this year, the Serious Crime Review Group, which is part of the Metropolitan Police, were asked to conduct a review into basically three things. It was the review of the investigation into the murder of Sandra Ribbett, the attempted murder of Lady Veronica Lucan, and the subsequent disappearance of Richard John Bingham, 7th Earl of Lucan. And I can exclusively reveal on this radio program today that a total of no less than 23 recommendations were made by the Detective Chief Inspector, who was asked to review this. So obviously the Metropolitan Police are still actively trying to make some attempt to resolve these outstanding matters that have gone on now for the past 32 years. I've never met Lord Lucan. My information basically is like many other people. He became embroiled in this situation where he cared passionately for his three children, Lady Camilla being the youngest, and then Lord George and the elder of the three children, Lady Frances. And because of the divorce situation, I think he was driven to do some dreadful things that he later really, really regretted. But unfortunately, because of two pieces of damning information that was provided to the Metropolitan Police in less than 24 hours after the murder, the situation became impossible for him to come back and deal with the situation as he intended to. And he made that perfectly clear a couple of hours after the murder in a phone call to the Dowager, his mother. But as a person, he was a gambler who enjoyed the high life. I think in the years after the murder, he probably had to alter his ways slightly, but still maintained contact with his old haunts, as it were.
Whatever about the jury's verdict in the murder case of Sandra Rivet, the jury of those around Castlebar with an interest in Lord Lucan as to whether he's dead or alive is in no way as conclusive.
I really believe he's alive, because he'd be about 76 now. But he was very fond of life, and life was very good to him. He was a man of leisure and pleasure. And he would have been wining and dining with all the stars and the big clubs in London and the rich area of London. And most likely he would have been wining and dining with Queen Elizabeth's sister, Princess Margaret, when she was out in the clubs wining and dining as well. And they would have all interacted. And of course they were related anyways. The royals, the Lucans and the Windsors were related through marriage anyway, through the Spencers. But he was a man that would have had fast cars, fast women, smoking the finest of cigars, and gambling. He was a professional gambler. And he was very dapper and fairly good-looking bloke, and he flaunted what he had. And we have two Irish expressions here, two Irish words. Kerrigales, he was a pretender. He was a Kerrigale. He was pretending. He was on the stage of life, and he was acting away, and people were looking up to him, or he felt they were. And he got married, and it was like the Charles Diana wedding would have been pomp and ceremony, and of course all these things would have been fixed. But of course his good life came to an end. In fact, the James Bond character was based on him, and he was screen tested for the character, but he failed. He wasn't capable. He was a good actor on the world stage, but not on the professional stage, and he failed that. So your James Bond character, able to gamble and get all the lovely ladies and all that and the fast cars, was based on a character like him.
If Lord Lucan was alive, some journalism would have got him at this stage. Come on, let's be honest. The Sun, the Mirror, the Mail, whatever, the English tabloids would have hunted him down. Nothing escapes these guys. So, come on, nobody is that good. Nobody hides that good from the Sun or the Mirror. You must be joking.
No, my information is that he is dead, and I also believe that I've actually visited the crematorium where his body was disposed of.
The press comes over here every so often on the 20th anniversary, the 25th, the 30th, and they'll be here again on the 40th, most likely, and the 50th, because Lucan is like the Loch Ness Monster, the Castlebar Loch Ness Monster. He rises every so often, and the legend is grown by the years, and grown legs as well. And sometimes one can be poetic about the truth, and sometimes there's facts. But this man was rather fed up being asked by the international press and the English press, like The Guardian and The Times came here, that type of paper came here doing research. And they asked him, they said, do you think Lucan is still alive, like you're asking me? And his answer was that Lucan was recently seen riding shoreguard on a misty isle off the coast of Scotland. And that was his story. But I do think if natural causes hasn't taken him away, then I think he's still alive. Well, he was well fed and well looked after, and he lived a good life.
If you walk around the streets of Castlebar, the hand of Bingham's everywhere. I mean, we mightn't like it, but I mean, the Richard Streets, the Charles Streets, the Lucan Streets, Cavendish Lane, the Mall itself, Spencer Street. These are all directly connected to Lucan. And in some senses, I suppose, Castlebar wouldn't exist without Lucan.
It's interesting that when you go to the Green and the Mall in Castlebar, everybody calls it the Mall. But the Mall is actually the way up to the Protestant church. And Lord Lucan could walk from his house, which was no great shakes as an architectural gem or anything like that, and walk up to the church without seeing the local people. And of course the green was for cricket. And when I see the people playing hurling on it now, I said, if Lord Lucan came back now, he wouldn't be at all pleased. So you don't hear the sound of the ball on the cricket bat in Castlebar anymore.
If they founded Castlebar, do the Australians deny or mistreat or ignore the people who founded Australia? Most of them were convicts and thugs, and I mean, I don't think they do. They may not necessarily build huge statues to them, but they recognise that they existed, and I think probably the Binghams created Castlebar, the town, and they should be recognised as such. And at this remove, let's say thank you, guys, if that's the correct term. Didn't like what you did, but come on, thanks for the town.
The saga of Lord Lucan remains unsolved. Still no final twist in the tale of a remarkable plot. Dead or alive, who knows? The Life and Times of Lord Lucan was produced by Ronan Courell and Tommy Marren. The producers would like to acknowledge the contributors to this programme: Ernie Sweeney, Michael Mullen, Liam Egan, Joe Harris, Enda Kenny TD, Tom Gillespie, and Ian from whereislucan.com.
This programme was made with the support of Sound and Vision Broadcasting Funding Scheme, a BCI initiative.